role of elected officials during emergency response and also during peacetime. So once again, I'll pass straight to James so he can crack into his delivery, but once again, there'll be opportunities for questions for both of us throughout the session.
Yeah, please do ask questions as we go rather than waiting to the end if they come up. It's always good to be able to present to councillors about, the role in an emergency. It's a time that responsibilities change, and so it's important that you're aware of them. So let's just jump through this pretty quickly. We'll talk a wee bit about the structure of civil defence emergency management, just so you understand that, and then how that structure changes during an emergency, and the declaration process. And there's just the cover of the book I just handed out there. It's just a wee guide that the Canterbury CDM group produced. We actually borrowed it from Otago and updated it, but that's just a reference document for you on that role. Great little statement here. This was Geoffrey Palmer back when he was the Prime Minister for that very short period of time. Sometimes does a power of good to remind ourselves that we live where two tectonic plates meet, that Tom was talking about earlier, in a somewhat lonely stretch of windswept ocean just above the roaring 40s. If you want drama, you've come to the right place. That's our country. So, in Canterbury, here's just a list of various emergencies that we've had, and it's not fully up to date actually, but damage-causing emergencies, in our distant and recent history. And you can see there that floods are certainly top of the list, but storms, they're up there. Fires are up there. They're all events that we see on a reasonably regular basis. We have to have a Civil Defence Emergency Management Group plan. We updated this last year and got approval for it to be updated. And it really just goes through just outlining at very strategic level how we approach the social side of managing emergencies, the economic and the environmental side of what we need to do. And within it, there are goals, objectives and targets that we have to meet. And Timaru District Council, as part of that membership of the CDM group, also has to try and meet those goals and targets. And then it outlines the sort of the administrative arrangements, or what we call comprehensive emergency management, which is reduction, readiness, response and recovery. We'll go into that a little bit more detail. So in BAU, at the side at the bottom, the most important place, we've got community. That's where civil defence emergency management starts, and that's why we engage with our community so much about readiness to disasters of various sorts and get them to understand our hazards. Then moves up to our territorial authorities, the regional level and then the national level. And so that sort of structure is pretty embedded and seems to be the way that we do things. But when we look at the CDM group, it's sort of in that sort of particularly regional local space, we have a Civil Defence Joint Committee or Group Joint Committee. And that's where our political leaders, our mayors, or delegated councillors sit and provide that sort of really high-level strategic governance to what we do. And so, Nigel, you sit on that and support us with what we do. Going down, we have the Coordinating Executive Group, where all our Chief Executives sit, and Bede's our Chair at the moment. But it's not just the local authorities, it's our emergency service partners and a couple of government organisations like MPI sit on that and provide that strategic planning, strategic leadership for us. Then have the group office where I sit, really providing that sort of regional coordination across the group or across the Canterbury area, supporting Phil in the decisions and the activities that he needs to do, as well as the emergency managers and all our other councils. And below that we have each of our councils, and each of those have civil defence officers that do the same sort of work that Phil and Lamorna do. And lots of partners. So Lifeline's district health boards or Te Whati Ora now, emergency services, iwi, and that sort of thing. So they all come and help support what we do. It's definitely not just a local government thing. It is a all of society thing almost. And just quickly on NEMA, so NEMA is the National Emergency Management Agency. They're the national partner in all of this. It's just worth knowing that they've existed now for almost 2 years. They started with about 60 staff and rapidly increased to about 160. And that's put extra demands on us at local government level. And yet our local government structures haven't changed to meet those national structures. So just something to be aware of. There's a lot more pressure at that national level coming down, like you were seeing everywhere else and was just talked about. We're seeing it too in that civil defence emergency management space. Quickly into that reduction, readiness, response and recovery space, just section 64 talks about the responsibilities of local authorities, so that's territorials as well as regional. We've got to have plans, and more importantly there, you need to be able to ensure that you can function to your fullest during an emergency. That may mean that it's at a reduced level, but you still have a responsibility to be able to do those core local government duties that we have. And so, we always encourage and talk about business continuity planning. It's something we talk about with businesses a lot. It's also something that's worth council just having a think about. I'm not necessarily going to say that your emergency manager should do it. They've already got another job to do, but do think about business continuity and how you can keep functioning when a disaster happens. The reduction space, interestingly here, the statistics are that every dollar we spend on reduction saves about $8 in recovery, and we're seeing that in places like Esk Valley and Hawke's Bay right now. The cost of people living in the places that they were living in is expensive when disasters happen. So we have a responsibility, and we mainly do it through the planning instruments that we have as councils, to identify and reduce the cost of emergencies where we can. It's always a tough one because we want to make sure that we have thriving communities and we're developing, but we've also got to make sure that we're not putting people at harm if we can avoid it. But really, from a civil defence point of view, we've only got an advocacy role. Although it's spelled out that we should be doing it, we've got no levers or no mechanisms that we can actually use. They really do sit in that planning space and through other mechanisms that councils have. Through into the readiness space, it's all about planning and preparation. That's what we spend most of our time doing, is being ready to respond to the emergencies and then to be ready to recover. But this is also where we work with our communities in one way or another to support them about being ready. And we talked about with the AF8 space this morning, one of the things I suggested was, storing more water. That's a readiness activity that we try to encourage. And, thinking about how you might, repurpose your gas barbecue to actually cook your meals at night time should there be no electricity or no power. That's all in that space. And then response when we actually do ramp up, something's happened and we need to respond to that emergency. So what's the extent of what we do? Most of our work, if I can say the bread and butter, is in that natural hazard space. But we also get involved in quite a few other events that are often very challenging. So, in Christchurch, the mosque shooting, for example, we were involved a lot in supporting the Muslim community through that event. In other parts of the country, M. bovis response and the velvet leaf response took up a lot of emergency management time in supporting those other government agencies, particularly NPI, in dealing with that. And hazardous chemical spills, the electroplating place here in Timaru was one such case of that quite a few years ago now. So in an emergency, the structure doesn't really change that much. It's still community-led, it's still community-driven, and the more that our community can look after itself, the easier it is for all of us. But then as we move up through that system, we might have a local incident control point. That's more likely to be something that police, FENS, or one of the emergency service partners do. then through to a local EOC, the Regional Coordination Centre or the National Coordination Centre. So you've got that hierarchical structure there. Just being aware, that regional level where I work, it's more about coordination, it's more about supporting what you're delivering into your communities at a local level. So coordination and support, but if we have to, we can direct. And likewise at a national level, if there's a national emergency, the national controller can direct us all to do something in a particular way. So we've got to be ready for that. Just on states of emergency, there are only two forms of states of emergency. There's a national state of emergency or a local state of emergency. There actually isn't any such thing as a regional state of emergency. So local can be done for the region, the territorial authority, or a ward, or any combination thereof. And so when it's done, the geographic area must be identified. We must actually spell out that area. And the group controller, so if there was a declaration made here, say in Timaru, I actually become in charge, but my powers are delegated to Phil or one of the other Timaru controllers. So they're delegated down. When that happens, we get legislative protection, so we're protected against the decisions we make, apart from in the health and safety space. So we still have to take care of health and safety as we would. That does not change. And we can activate without a state of emergency. So quite often, at the start of an event or during a smaller event, we'll be activated at an emergency operations centre or the coordination centre, but we won't actually have any powers to make any decisions. We're just there supporting it. And just some quick examples, I'm going to fly through these really quickly. The COVID-19 response, that was a national state of emergency. Here's some the flooding around that. Where was this? This was not Ashburton. Yeah, 21. Yeah. 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 So local state of emergent, but done regionally. And in that regional one for that 21 flooding, so it actually started with Ashburton declaring a local for Ashburton first. Timaru followed quite quickly, and then Selwyn, and then eventually there was a regional one because it was impacting the whole of the region, put across all of us. It actually had some really complicating factors later on as we moved into recovery and how we actually managed that. But I won't talk too much about that today. So yeah, some of the Rangitata flooding, 2017, and then July 22, which was one of the last ones here in Timaru, at Mill Road, where a very small ward-based declaration was made because some people wouldn't leave their homes and felt that they're unsafe being there, so we needed to use the evacuation power. So there's quite a conversation. I think, Nigel, you were away at the time, weren't you? But with, who's your deputy mayor?
Yeah. No, I was Deputy Mayor Will, Steve. He's not with us now. Yeah. Not with us in regard to around the table. He's still with us.
Yeah. So, and so Bede and Paul Cooper were all involved in those discussions to support what we would do to, make sure that we protected these people. The process itself... yeah.
Sorry, James, maybe just worth noting that you can't do anything. You could persuade them, but it was only, and they didn't want to take it, it was only when you had a state of emergency that we could actually had the power to go and get these people and say you've now got to leave, and that was why we had to exercise the state of emergency.
Yeah.
And I think it's, in our case, a ward is as small as we can go because you have to be able to define the area, and so a ward is something that has a distinct definition and boundary, but that was why, so that they had originally left, came back, and then so the only way you can then manage it is by declaring a state of emergency.
And that forced evacuation actually results in the police having to arrest them. So it's not just a simple case of saying you can move on now. If we need to, we actually have to arrest them. So if you're sort of thinking in those larger scale events, and tsunami would be our worst case, we might tell people to evacuate, and we can enforce it, but the realities are we don't have the resourcing to go and enforce it from the point of view of arresting people. So it's not just that straightforward all the time.
It's probably more likely the Milford huts where that's going to be a benefit into the future, isn't it?
Yeah. And of course we had that conversation not that long ago. So Phil rang up and said, the Milford huts with the high sea swell that we're having at the time, along with quite some rain up in the foothills that had come down, there was a threat to Milford huts. So we prepared to declare to evacuate should we need to do that. So we didn't declare, but we prepared. Process itself, the declaration has to be made by a mayor or a delegated elected representative, and I think that's a key thing. That delegation, we've sort of since found out, can't just be a verbal thing. It's supposed to be in writing. However, we know that we've got away with it in the past, but just be aware that delegation to a other person is meant to be in writing.
Because I think with that one at the time, I think we've done that via email or something like that.
Yeah.
That's obviously enough,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yes, you delegate too. Yeah.
And I think if you've got normal standing orders within council about delegations, then that also works. So, the best thing is to have standing orders in council around delegations rather than having to do it at the time. Controllers themselves can't declare. We cannot declare. We can only advise on it. But once it's in place, the group controller and local controllers need to do the coordination and the direction should it be required. So there's a sort of a shift in power at that point in time, and that's why they're emergency powers. So it's definitely worth understanding that happens. So and we can talk more about this, but worth thinking about, what those responsibilities of your mayor and elected officials become. And I think, the first thing is, looking after your own family and yourselves first. As elected officials, do have a think about, what it means for your family in that role that you have, and whether you can go off and do your community support and engagements like you do, while they're still potentially being impacted. Indicate your availability to the mayor and to the EOC so that they actually know that you're okay and can assist if required. You may end up being appointed as the spokesperson for the emergency. And so you may have that public-facing conversation with the public through the media. And what we try and do now is we try and do that in a collaborative way. So the mayor would get up, or an elected official would get up and do the overall response to the event, and then the controller or the emergency service partners talk about the specifics that we need our community to do. And we're finding that starts to work quite well. It was practiced a lot in Nelson, Tasman during the fires, and it seems to work quite well. You are sort of the eyes and ears of the community, and if you're hearing things that are going on, particularly things that are worrying that's happening in your community, raise them with the EOC. One of the things I would ask is don't, and I'll say this carefully, but don't make promises to your community. Sometimes they may not be possible to actually achieve, but listen to them, understand what the problems are, and bring them to the EOC, bring them to council so that we can actually work out how we're best to deal with them. That would be a plea. It means it helps us in actually responding to the event. And do not lead or run the emergency. The controller has responsibility for that. So there's that power shift. There is checks and balances in place. So if you end up with a rogue controller, someone who's gone absolutely crazy and starts doing silly things, they can be removed. So, it's not a once they're in, you're in trouble kind of thing. And then recovery. We're seeing recovery in Auckland and Hawke's Bay and Te Rāwhiti at the moment, and it's huge. It goes on for a long time, and it's incredibly draining. It's based over the four environments, so the built, the social, the economic, and the in the natural or the environmental space, we sometimes now also include cultural in that. It often gets interwoven between all of those. The built environment is expensive, but usually relatively easy to do. And I saw Andrew was here before, and we had to do that here with Timarua after the flooding. But the social and the economic and the natural environments, the recovery in those spaces is much more challenging and more difficult because we often don't have funding actually available to us that we can use in that space. We have to look at, we have to repurpose funding or reappropriate or get it from somewhere else or go begging to government organisations. It can be a real challenge. And we know that it goes on for a long time. The emergency might only go for 2 or 3 weeks. Recovery could actually go for years, months or years. And then look, I've just got a couple of points here. This came out of a piece of work that resilience organisations did on the board's role in crisis. So it was based on some local government boards, some national boards, and some private boards. But these were some of the comments that they came up with as 6 things to really think about to support your organisation when an emergency is occurring. And the first is be prepared. We've covered that about your own personal preparedness. Preparedness of the council itself is all important. Jump in early in the response and work as a coach, work as an advisor. Support what's going on, be another sounding board, be as an elected official, I'm seeing this in the community, I think we need to do something about it. A suggestion might be this, and work through with your controller and your staff how you might actually deliver that. Your trust and relationships are critical. I would say, I got asked the tough question at our last joint committee, what did Auckland do wrong? And I'm not going to say what Auckland did wrong, that's not the right place to do that. But what I would say is I think here in Canterbury, across all of our councils, at a regional level and at a local level, we have good relationships with our mayors and elected officials and chief executives. I know Phil and Bede can have conversations, and I know Phil and Nigel can have conversations if they need to. Those relationships that are built before the emergency are absolutely critical. So encourage them and allow them to happen, because that will stop you getting in the Auckland headlights. There was no relationship between the mayor and the emergency management team, unfortunately, in Auckland when they had their first event. Be agile in decision making. Be prepared to change. Be prepared to make decisions, and if they don't work out how to change them. Don't be fixed on any one idea when responding to a disaster. We often talk about if we've made a decision with less than 40% of information, we've made it too soon. But if we've made it when we've got more than 70% of the information about what's going on, we've made it too late. So actually working in an area of ambiguity, and we need to be able to flex and change as we move in that disaster setting. And prepare for the long haul, and then amplify health and safety. And we certainly, as I previously mentioned, health and safety doesn't go away. We need to keep considering it in a disaster. And then just from a group perspective across the region, some of our priorities at the moment, we're about to embark on an external review of the CDM group, so we'll be getting external consultants to review how we work. That will be at the regional and local level, so we'll be doing a whole check across the whole system as to whether or not we're working effectively or how we could be better. Part of that's developing a group-wide work program. Over the last few years, we've had regional programs and local programs. They haven't been well connected together, so we're going to try and do some more connection around what it looks like across the whole region. Work in that AF8 space and that major incident planning space. So we mentioned the national framework that's being put in place. We're trying to do a similar framework so it's less hazard specific, but able to respond to those more serious events. And then we're still working through the 21 flood after action working groups. So impact and needs assessment, we're just about there with those. We're very close to, very, very close to having a consistent view of what's happened to our roads across the region, and really important to thank you as a district council for supporting that. And then in the rural space, which Phil actually leads, we're looking at really understanding the roles and responsibilities across the rural sector so we can see where there's gaps and where there's duplication before we do further work. And that capacity and workload bit will get integrated into the external review. And then lastly, the emergency management bill is ready to go to Parliament. It probably won't before, or it certainly won't have its first reading before the elections, but it's got pretty much cross-party support. So after the elections, no matter which party is in power, it'll still go ahead. And we're likely to see this select committee process start late in the year or early in the new year, and undoubtedly Timaru District Council will want to put a submission in on that. And that's up. So happy to take any questions or comments or the rules.
Questions for the team?
I guess just in your current priorities, I guess in my mind the risk to life would be at the top. I mean, it's not mentioned here,
I suppose what I've got there are more sort of project-based activities as opposed to, you know, the overall priorities. And yes, risk to life is our first thing. And then we, you know, if we're actually looking at the nationalised priorities in that disaster setting, risk to life, and then we start to move down risks to property, social disorder. So there's actually a set list, and we use that for prioritisation during a disaster, but they're definitely there.
How do you, when you're doing an evacuation, how do you make contact with the people? You know, do you have access to the cell phone alert, or because I remember after the Rangitata floods, I can't remember whether it was Civil Defence or Council, but you know, both in the same in this instance, I guess, didn't know who all the people were in that area, only had company names on the database and didn't have phone numbers. So is that something Council need to improve our database, and maybe it has since then, I don't know. Or how does that work?
Yeah, it's it becomes a challenge in those rural areas, where the property owner might be a farmer but might have 4 or 5 properties for the workers to where they live. Our easiest and quickest way of getting messages out to the community are now using that emergency mobile alert, and we use that during the Rangitata flooding to alert people. But of course, that's only going to reach people that have got a cell phone and have that cell phone turned on. Otherwise, still radio is an important mechanism for alerting people, and getting messages into our local radio stations is important. And then for smaller events, it might still be us or our partner agencies going and knocking on people's doors. And so, certainly in that Milford Hut space, there's a siren there, but it would also be knocking on people's door and saying you've got to get out.
Just to that as well, Councillor Pye, one of the advantages about it being kept local is an actual fact, which is why the local component is important, is people do actually know that on a farmhouse there are 4 cottages and so is away, or they're not. So that's why we do emphasise in terms of that community and having that local, and brokering those relationships becomes also another way in which we do manage it, and one of the drivers for us about not getting support from central and regional government, but the responses are locally led and initiated, and so it's quite important, just as it is to know that certain roads will flood in a certain event or will be exposed. So that also is part of it, which is why we work at Paul, Phil, Lamorna, James. There is quite an effort on working on those relationships with a variety of agencies and stakeholders.
So do you access other people's databases, or can you do that? Because I remember at the time, and this was a couple of days after the event, I don't know, they might have been following up on just how you're getting on. You know, as a farmer, we get once a year something from, I think it's Assure Quality, and it's a Westpac helicopter thing where you put down all your contact details and coordinates. So all that information is somewhere that you'd think you should be able to share it and access it, you know, if you needed to.
Generally speaking, I would say no, unless it's been made available to us and we know about it. If it becomes known to us that database is there and it would be useful, and there is a declared state of emergency, we can. We've still got to go through like a normal court order process, but we can order that information to be released. But you know, would have to be pretty important circumstances for us to do that. During the Christchurch earthquake, we used it to secure dental records and people's wills out of lawyers' offices that were in the cordon. So we used some of those powers at that point in time, but they're on that sort of pretty draconian end of the powers, and there's still checks and balances that we have to put in place to use them. But we could. We do rely on other organisations. So, in that rural space, Federated Farmers, the industry organisations like Beef and Lamb, they can often become quite important conduits for us into the farming community. And that's why we're doing this roles and responsibilities in the rural space, so that we know who has what connections in which parts of the rural space. And if we move past beef and lamb and dairy and cropping, and it's sort of into the horticultural space, it even gets bigger. But yeah.
What sort of things have we learned from Gabriel? What sort of things have we learned from Cyclone Gabriel going forward, especially around the recovery?
Oh, recovery. I think the lessons for recovery are still to come, but those impacted areas where they haven't had significant emergencies like we have had in Canterbury, are not ready for this sort of thing. We've had these events and we've experienced them either in the large scale as in the earthquakes, or smaller scales as in the floods, to know that we've got to do these activities and to be at least ready for them in the sense of the relationships and the thoughts that we've got to do it. That's already in place. In Hawke's Bay, and particularly in Auckland, they haven't experienced the scale that we've seen previously, and I suppose they don't have a mindset of what it actually takes. But lessons for recovery, I think, haven't come out yet. I know that Richard Ball, our group recovery manager, has monthly catch-ups with your recovery manager and the other regional recovery managers. And as lessons come out, he'll be talking about them. From a response point of view, so Phil and I we got deployed to Northland and supported the Kaipara district in their response. And the thing that stood out for me in small councils that haven't had much emergency activation before is their understanding of the importance of displaying information. And so, when I look at our Canterbury emergency operations centres, when they're activated or when they're exercising, there's always whiteboards on the walls, or there's computer screens with what's happening, what we're seeing, what we're doing. And when you go to small councils like Phil and I did, and you didn't see that, and you could see the struggles that they're having, the advice to them would be get information displayed. Make it so the staff that are working in that space can actually see it. Any other thoughts for, you were at Dargaville, you were right in the middle of it, and then you went to Hawke's Bay as well.
I think it's just reinforcing what James said, but it's just round about that. Paul talks about it in Bede as being match fit. We've had a lot of little events and medium events, and obviously, unfortunately, a couple of large events, and we actually just know what we need to do, but also our partner agencies has that trust with us as well. So I think that works both ways. I think that gets us up and going. The thing that keeps me awake at nights is we haven't had the big one yet, especially in South Canterbury. We've had a lot of medium ones, so people just assume it's a rinse and repeat of that. It's not an East Valley or something like that. So what would that look like, and how would we support the response and also then drive into recovery?
Just going to add, and some of the work that working group, for instance, on the transport, is so that there's a single source of truth for people to know which roads are passable, which aren't, and so on. And you can go, and we want to integrate that to that point. So that's part of the response. The other part, which is the advocacy work of CDM, but also all of the councils in Canterbury in particular, is, and we saw that number, a stitch in time saves 9, in terms of both minimising the impact but also supporting a recovery, and that's something we need to do a lot more of, particularly around the flooding events. So, and that was why, to Councillor Scott's point about that funding for river resilience didn't come through. Actually, it can have a significant and direct impact when an event arises, and that's a stitch in time saves 9 kind of concept.
Just on that single source of truth, how does that work? Because we saw in the Hawke's Bay there's multiple sources of mistruth. So what kind of comm strategy do you have between everyone? So there is, because even between, I don't think it was here, but I've seen online of NZ Waka Kotahi on their website will say one road's closed, but a local government one will say it's not. So how do you get that? I mean, it's never going to be perfect.
I mean, the road space is a challenge, and so this roading project that we've been doing around being able to get all the local roading data and the Waka Kotahi data all into one place, it's a milestone event as far as I'm concerned. One of the things that we do here in Canterbury is when there's an emergency on, I hold a daily briefing where the EOCs that are impacted and the partner agencies will call in once a day or twice a day, sometimes twice a day, and we use that to create that awareness of what's going on in the whole region. So it's not just the issues that are happening here in Timaru. We make sure that everyone knows what's happening in Timaru, Waimate, and say Mackenzie. And that means that if you are talking to the media, at least you have a little bit of awareness of what's happening outside of your boundaries. And so that helps with getting that one source of truth or that common theme across what we do. Sorry? We don't have media at those briefings, no. We keep them out of that so that we can have those free and frank conversations that we need. Occasionally there will be councillors involved, but that's only occasionally if they're invited into that process. But it's after that so one of the functions within an emergency operations centre is the public information management. We call it PIM. And so council communication staff are involved in those, and same at the regional level. And they're very, very good networkers on a day-to-day basis. Our comms staff across our councils tend to be talking amongst themselves all the time. And that means that in an emergency, they can just use those relationships to once again make sure that there's that awareness of messaging, and that it's never going to be perfect, it's never going to be exactly the same, but at least we're driving consistency as much as we can.
We don't invite an emergency so you can see how it works, but down in the EOC, what happens is it is, and all of the partner agencies, so you've got Kotahi, St John, FENS, Police, ourselves, ECAN, and they'll all report in, and from that a picture is built, and it is at the height of these emergencies, it's twice a day as a rule, and they do all report in, and then sort of messaging is sent out. And actually, I recall something Councillor Parker's been very good at is directing people to a website where all of the single source of truth is, which really helps to say this is what it is, so that they might say that, it becomes important if a road is impassable for, in those days it was the DHB, to know if there was anybody with health needs on a particular road, and they would then inform St John, who were all there. So that's sort of how the picture is built up.
Yeah, it's interesting. Less is more, and like I have a blanket approach with those emergencies that I won't post anything, and I'll just send it all to the TDC, because then people will make comments and ask you questions, and you don't have time to respond, and so you're almost better off not, or you've done it very simply, just put them to the to the right direction. But that's the issue when locally you've got the likes of South Canterbury Today. You don't want them to make comment, and and so you need control over that. And saying that, Stephen and the team are pretty good at picking up all of that. But yeah, it's interesting. I think I just want to speak to one thing. We're quite lucky that we've sort of got separate. We're lucky to be sizable enough. I think you spoke to the site, the Kuipers and those ones that have those challenges. But we're lucky with BAU that Bede's role is not involved in civil defence at all, and so he can concentrate on BAU if we've got funding issues to put to where we need, which is quite good. But there's some councils whereby actually the chief executive's a controller as well, which is a fascinating challenge in its own right.
Yep.
And also, outside of Tom's earthquake, which we hope, touch wood, I've just renamed it. We've been lucky enough to have quite early warning. If there's a orange warning, the team will normally flick me a message or what have you, and they keep us all up to date, which is great. And we know pretty much it's going to affect our royal wards, so it's likely to be the three of you more involved. But councillors specifically, have you got any questions? Because I think this is a key one, the opportunity now, because you will get pressure on what are you doing, and it just has to be so simple. And I remember talking to the mayor in Napier at a meeting recently, and it was really frustrating for the councillors because they didn't have a role for some time because council normal BAU wasn't really operating, and so you needed to put that resource, sometimes very keen, somewhere. So it's just to understand what people's role is and really keep to it. So it's highly supportive, as opposed to I'm sure I'm confident with our team we'll be fine, but you can imagine in some councils it can be a hindrance.
Well, I'd say Nigel, having an internal process within Timaru of keeping all of you informed about what's going on. So not necessarily coming into the briefing in the EOC, but maybe afterwards, Bede or Phil or the controller giving you a brief about what's going on, so that you can relay stuff to your constituencies, but also get information back would be a very good practice thing to do.
I always like to follow up with, if you see something out in the community that is happening, don't hesitate to ring me, because once again our district is quite diverse and quite expansive, so sometimes it's a sunny day here and it's a howling nor'wester down the Rangitata Gorge or down the Rangitata, and we don't know what is happening. So once again, we've got good connections across our partner agencies, but sometimes that's heads up of this forecast looks unusual, or this event is not behaving the way it should, is once again forewarned is forearmed as well. I like to think I'm quite proactive with engaging with the controllers and the mayor and the CE to say, hey, look, something's bubbling away, I'm not comfortable, but we're just watching it, to try and give that reassurance up and down and across.
Yeah, that's right, Phil. Actually, it was the December 2019, the island was cut in half. We couldn't get across anywhere, and within a few hundred metres of the Rangitata, the irrigators are going because it's so dry. So it does actually, to Phil's point, you get that irony of it. Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
got one quick question. Just regarding events, like normally you look at flooding and earthquakes and stuff, wildfires. Now we're having more and more of these sudden downpours, and they cause real issues. We're not immune to it. We had one at Peel Forest, had 87 mils of rain in an hour, just about washed the new fire station away. Block culvert could have been the reason why. A few other things, but the Kowhai stream, where it's renowned for danger, there's been people killed there before through flooding. How much does that play on your guys' minds now? Because that must be really concerning.
It's huge. We are definitely seeing the Met Service put more orange warnings, out into public, and we're having a lot more engagement with the Met Service before red warnings are being done. So most of the time they don't put a red warning directly in place without having a conversation with us. Sometimes they do, and that's usually quite urgent, but most of the time they'll actually have a conversation with us around, what else is happening in the region that would mean we've got to think more about it. So, if we've had a couple of days of orange rain, for example, and then there's another, expected orange warning coming at the end of the week, say, they may actually have a conversation with us and turn that into a red because they know the ground's already super saturated and that there's actually, increased potential for risk of flooding. So that's one thing that happens. As far as, these heavier downpours in localised areas or even spread out, I'm not sure if I've got an easy answer to that, but, everything is indicating that we'll see more of it, and we just need to be ready for it. And it is an issue. But if your civil defence teams are activated, let's say 40 or 50 days of the year, that's probably a loss of double that in actual work that they can actually do. So these events happening time after time are actually having a compounding effect on the actual work that we need to get to. So yeah, we will see more. That's almost certain.
I was just going to say, I know we have spoken to Councillor Oliver, but those sudden onset events, the thunderstorms, that really short, sharp, that's back to community to acknowledge those risks themselves and the environment they live in, and obviously back to the emergency services to do that initial response. Then I'm hopeful that that's when we then get looped into something has happened in Peel Forest or something has happened here, and we can then step in and support. But it's very hard for us to respond immediately because we haven't got a response component, and that's where fire and emergency and police and all those other response agencies do that great work. But we need to be looped into that it is happening. But local knows best. We keep being told that, and I totally believe it. So once again, if you see a big cloud above your house, one would suggest it's about to rain.
Oh, sorry, just one last question, if I may. What about, because civil defence has a voluntary nature to it, doesn't it, with volunteers from the community? So are you like every other voluntary organisation up and down the country that struggles for volunteers, or are you pretty well placed?
We never have enough volunteers. Lamorna's doing a great job with bolstering the teams in Geraldine, Waimeti, Geraldine, Tamuka and Pleasant Point, and then we've got a response team here in Timaru that can do a wee bit more advanced stuff. But we need more, and it's how we engage with them, how we support them, how we train them, because sometimes with volunteers, they actually want action. So if we don't have anything for a year, they go looking for it somewhere else or somewhere to fulfil their volunteerism need. And then on the flip side, they get too much. And they say, oh, no, I only thought I'd only be doing a couple of days, a year. So short story, yes, we would like to have more, but it's that balancing act of keeping them engaged, trained to a level that we're comfortable to utilise them, and how they can support the communities.
Can I just add something? I know Phil I was just saying, as a controller and as practitioners, as it were, we often talk about the confusion around civil defence because it's an abstract concept for most people, and they'll say, I didn't see civil defence, and then Phil will say, well, did you see police? Did they knock on your door? Oh yeah, no, they came and saw us, yeah. Did you see somebody from, I don't know, the rural support sort of agency, what they call? Oh yeah, no, they came and saw us as well. And they just don't realise actually that that is civil defence. Civil defence is a coordination, it's a management framework. So it's an abstract concept. It's not, there isn't some army of people putting a pair of undies over their trousers and running out the door. We just have to make sure in local government that we transmit that actually you are civil defence. The people you talk to, they are civil defence, and there's personal responsibility in there as well to be prepared and be resilient. As most rural communities are, but we townies struggle a bit more with it. But we should be selling that message. So I just wanted to say that. If you're out and about, cheers.
Good point.
Anything further? No, that was good. Thank you. Really appreciate your time. Again, thanks Tom and thanks James. That's really helpful. Unfortunately, as soon as we normally get educated on these things, so everyone touch wood and
Test that, do we?
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time, and like if any further civil defence emergency management questions come up in the future, I'm more than happy to help support Phil with those conversations with you if you want. So yeah, thank you.